Welcome to the Hawley Local History Society. Tonight's talk is by Bob Evans on the villages, hamlets and features along the A25 ridge, known as the String of Pearls.
It's the first time I've ever been filmed doing one of these things. I've always wanted to be in the movies, actually. Talking about movies, horrible afternoon on the whole, wasn't it, with driving rain and wind and all the rest of it. So we sit and watch the old films. The other week we watched Ben-Hur. We liked Ben, but we didn't think much of her. But our preferred option is the old cowboy films, actually. But you don't see so many of them these days, do you? In fact, I think it's all quiet on the Western Front. Shall we get on with things? Yeah. Okay, just by way of introduction then, my name is Bob Evans. If you like this talk, my name is Bob Evans. If you don't like it, my name is Gary Lineker. I used to be, for my sins, the Director of Planning at Tandridge District Council, which is not Reigate and Banstead Borough Council, it's the next one over to the east. So we've got Caterham and Oxted and Lingfield. Anybody live in Tandridge? Perhaps some live in Smallfield or somewhere? There you go, welcome. Keep paying your council tax, it helps in our pension. So that's where I come from. And also, I am the chairman of Nutfield History Group, actually. And to have, I can only dream of having numbers like this to one of our talks, a fantastic turnout. Mind you, Nutfield is such a tiny little village, really. Right, as you see, we call it the String of Pearls. Now, when I first came to work for Tandridge Council, over 40 years ago, I'd previously been working for Westminster City Council, so it was a complete contrast, wasn't it? Dealing with Mayfair and Soho, the old West One postal area was my patch. So when I came out to countryside of East Surrey, I couldn't believe that I was getting paid to drive around and visit the villages, particularly the ones strung out along the Sandstone Ridge, the A25. And I thought each one of these villages is a little jewel, and you put the whole lot together and you've got a lovely necklace, which is why I call this talk the String of Pearls, if you like. So we're going from Nutfield to Westerham. It's about 12 miles, and if I talk at 24 miles an hour, you can do the maths, see how long it takes. Yeah, so there we are, there you have it, the String of Pearls. That's why this talk is called that. A little quiz for you to start with. Anybody tell me what that is? Come on. It's the FA Cup. Thank you. Anybody tell me what plant that is?
Wisteria?
That's right. Not as an old granny I used to know used to call it hysteria. And what about that birdie? That's the moon, so it's, I think we had it down here, nightingale, yeah. These will all come up in the String of Pearls. So I hope everybody's got a sight at least of a handout there that they can see where we're going. And we start off in the very west end of Tandridge District, Nutfield, almost adjoins onto Redhill, of course. And there it is. So here we are at Redhill. I don't think Surrey highways will be able to clear the snow like this these days, would they? But this is the A25 back in the 1920s, probably just about 100 years ago. Obviously the line of the road follows the crest of the Sandstone Ridge, so nothing changes there really. But I don't think with climate change we're ever going to see really deep snow like that. And in fact, it reminds me, during my lifetime, I can only ever remember 2 really, really bad winters. That was Mike and Burley. So here's the High Street, Nutfield. Now, Nutfield is a small village, as I've said, but it is important because it was visited by William the Conqueror soon after he invaded at Pevensey. Some of his army went up towards Dover, and a lot of it, though, went up through East Surrey and along the Sandstone Ridge, what became the A25, because he wanted to do a big circle and come to London from the north. He had a lot of allies that would help him on that route. So this is Nutfield High Street. It still looks pretty much the same now. This is the Queen's Head pub there. Not much has changed. Few street lights perhaps, and a more defined footway with curbstones. And just off the A25 is Nutfield Marsh. That's one of the places listed. That's just a tiny little hamlet, a few houses, and you can see cricket to this day played there. That pub in the background keeps changing its name. Last time I looked, it was called the Inn on the Pond, if you know that. Now there's a peculiar thing about Surrey churches. This is Nutfield Village, what we would call a nucleated village here, about a crossroads. This is the A25, east-west. But the church is some distance away. It's up here, you can just see it there. And the church and the manor house were always separated from the main part of the village. Nobody really knows why this was, but it's probably because the vicar in charge of the church probably wanted to keep away from the great unwashed in the village, and certainly the lord of the manor would want to do that. Sometimes, if the lord of the manor didn't live in the main house by the church, it was called the court house, and that's what it is in Nutfield. And we will see that repeated. There is Nutfield Church, still looks pretty much the same as that. And this is the Lord of the Manor's house, or the court house if he wasn't in residence at the time. Now, as we move away from Nutfield, travelling westwards, we come to a bit of a gap before you get to the next settlement. Now, this is what's called the Vale of Holmesdale. And during Neolithic times, nomadic people would come to this valley, really just off the Sandstone Ridge. Up to the north, you've got the scarp of the North Downs towards Caterham. And these nomadic people would do trading, especially with those that lived up at Caterham on the hill in the Iron Age fort there later, and they would trade animal skins and flints and things like that. And it became a regular place for them to visit. Year after year, they'd come back, do a bit of business, and move on. Gradually, they thought, well, actually, it's not a bad place, and it became what's known as a persistent place. And they would make their first settlements, and that's how settlements came into being. And this is what they look like, and that must be right, because this picture was supplied by Surrey County Council. It's got to be right. So there you are, Neolithic people then, along the string of pearls. Some pretty Neolithic types still there today, actually. Now we come to a really very spectacular house. This was built in 1636, and it's at a place called Pendle, and this is the house where a family called Kenrick lived. Jarvis Kenrick was a young man who lived for a while at this house. He also lived in Caterham for a bit, but he was the man who scored the very first goal in the very first FA Cup game back in 1871. So there you are, these people have got to live somewhere, haven't they? And he married the captain's sister, and between them they had 9 children. He went on to score a lot of goals for the various teams he played in. So he was prolific in the penalty area and in the bedroom as well. And that house actually was designed by a famous Palladian architect called Inigo Jones, and he's very famous for doing many buildings. The Banqueting House in Whitehall in London, still there of course, and St Paul's Church at Covent Garden with those massive pillars holding up the pediment there. And there's a blue plaque to commemorate the fact that Jarvis Kenrick lived in that house. Now we move on to Brewer Street, I think, is the next place we identify. And this house is all that's left of a vast 63-room Tudor palace. And it was called Bletchingley Palace, surprisingly. And its most famous resident was Anne of Cleves, the fourth wife of Henry VIII. She was given so much property to go quietly when Henry wanted the marriage annulled, that she amassed various properties, mostly in the south of England, became a very wealthy lady, but one of her favourite places to live was Bletchingley Palace. And this is the very middle bit of this 63-room palace, and you can imagine her very proficient horsewoman riding through that arch to get to her private quarters at the back. All that's left now is this remnant, which is a private house. I just wish they'd managed to get the front door a bit more symmetrical. And you may have seen this. You've got a calendar with views of Surrey on, your favourite views of Surrey. This one keeps appearing all the time. This is Brewer Street Farmhouse, a very famous hall house with jetted first floor you see there, and Grade 1 listed building. And it's got these fantastic Horsham slabs on the roof, and you'll notice that they're big where the eaves are. No wind could lift those up, but because they're so heavy, they had to diminish in size as you go towards the ridge, otherwise it would bring the whole place down with its weight. So you know it's a Horsham slab house if you've got the big tiles, big slabs at eaves level, and the small, much smaller ones at the top of the ridge. Brewer Street Farmhouse. And this is the rectory, which is just round the corner. Now, people who had nice houses like these would very often not want a hedge or a fence or a wall in front of their house because it spoiled their view. A nice outlook across open countryside from here, and as it was a rectory, you could see in the distance to Bletchingley Church, where the rector would strut his stuff. So instead of having a fence, they would have a ditch. And there's a ditch here and a ditch on the other side of the road down here, and that's called a ha-ha, of course, you all know that. It's sad that in these days of enhanced security, the owner-occupiers have had to put up a fence, but I suppose that's the least offensive fence, if you get my meaning. So that's the old rectory at Brewer Street. Now we're moving on our list. This is the parish church itself at Bletchingley, which is of great interest, I find. I'll tell you about a hermit who lived just here in a cell. But before that, we'll look at some of the memorials that feature in St Mary's Parish Church. This is a guy called Wilfrid Dunderdale, and he was called Biffy to his friends. He was a Royal Naval commander, he was a diplomat, and he was a spy. And one of his friends was Ian Fleming. And it is said that Ian Fleming based James Bond pretty much on Biffy Dunderdale. But it's lucky he changed the name, wasn't it? The name's Bond, James Bond. It doesn't really work with the name's Biffy Dunderdale. He wouldn't have got the girls with that, would he? So this is where Roger the Hermit lived at the parish church, and it was Henry II who left an order that Roger the Hermit should be supplied with food by the good people of Bletchingley, and he would sit and watch the masses from his cell through that lancet window there, and I think this is the sort of porthole where people were provided with food. Now, when I do this talk to the WI or even primary school children, they say, well, if he was stuck in that cell all the time, where did he go to the toilet? I don't know. He was a hermit. And inside the church as well, you've got this massive memorial here. This is an ugly great thing, actually. Talk about over the top. Baroque-style memorial to Robert Clayton, who was a former Lord Mayor of London, and I gather not a very nice person, because if you failed to meet your debts, he would go and distrain on you, and he got himself very wealthy by doing that sort of thing. And there is, up in the roof bosses, you've got a nice Bond girl herself there. So there's the marketplace in Bletchingley. This is about 100 years ago. Not much has changed. The only thing really that's changed is that there's now a war memorial there. Obviously, that wouldn't have been there at that time. But I'm pleased to say that the White Hart is the big old pub hotel, really, on that side of the marketplace, is being refurbished, and I hope it will remain as a hostelry. So these buildings along here were originally market stalls, and traders would put up their tables, perhaps with a little cover over them. Every day there was a market, and eventually they put up sheds because it was a bit of a palaver setting up a table every time, and eventually those sheds became houses, and that's how that row of dwellings came to be. But all the proportions and the width of the street is pretty much exactly as it is today. This is the other side of those houses. Again, it's one of your Surrey calendar views, and a very historic area, all listed buildings either side of it. In fact, when it was a busy market day, through travellers would come on horseback or on foot along this path, so they didn't get embroiled in all the carry-on in the marketplace. This is a peculiar building, just a few metres along the road in Bletchingley. It's probably the biggest building there, 3-storey, and it anticipated the construction of a railway line from Redhill, or Merstham more likely, to Godstone, some sort of Holmesdale Vale light railway. And one of the people associated with it thought, I'll steal a march here, I'll get the warehouse built ready for when there's a Bletchingley station. Well, it never happened, and the building became an Apple store because of all the orchards around the place, and it's now Lawrence's auction rooms, if that means anything to people. But it's a nice building, nice proportions, and fenestration pattern there. Now, Bletchingley was also a rotten borough. This was before the Great Reform Act of 1832, when a small village like Bletchingley had 12 voters at the time, but it had 2 MPs. And a burgeoning industrial city like Manchester didn't have a single MP to its name. Bletchingley had 2. Couldn't go on, could it? But during that time as rotten borough, it produced 2 prime ministers, Palmerston and Salisbury. And there you have them, and some other political characters that were involved with it. The Deputy Prime Minister and at the time Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sir Geoffrey Howe, lived in Bletchingley and was the member for East Surrey. There he is with Lady Howe, and as he was Chancellor he called his little dog Budgie. And this is him later on. He was actually Foreign Secretary here. Budget had moved on, and as he was Foreign Secretary he called this one Summit. So he had a good way of naming his pets. Anybody know who that is?
Desmond Tutu?
Correct. Desmond Tutu, he was a curate at the parish church, and there's a nice picture tribute to him in the church these days as well. He went on, of course, to be the Archbishop of Cape Town and the President of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. Did so much to heal the wounds of apartheid, and what a great man. Immensely popular family in the village, and obviously passed away now, but I think his family is still in touch with people in the village. So we move along to the next place. We go along the crest of the sandstone ridge, which you see in the middle of this picture here. I think we're at Chevington now, are we? Is that right? This is taken from the viewpoint at Caterham, and you can see some minerals workings here. This is where an extension of the minerals workings where the archaeologists have dug up all the flint tools left by the Neolithics. Very special sand that's dug out of this area in the Vale of Holmesdale, and it is used in engineering and was also used in cosmetics for a while. In fact, every tube of Colgate toothpaste produced in the world had a little pinch of Godstone sand in it, until the British Dental Association pointed out that it was taking the enamel of people's teeth. And I should have mentioned that Bletchingley, the other mineral that's extracted here is fuller's earth. And it was the fuller's earth that was so important in the wool industry of medieval times, when England was probably the richest country in the world based on its wool production. And the fuller's earth was such a valuable asset to them. It was used in fulling the sheep's fleece, purifying it and bleaching it to a degree, getting it ready for spinning. And that's why the place is called Bleachingly, because of the fuller's earth. The only other place in the south of England where it is quarried is in Bletchley in Buckinghamshire. So you see the connection with the names there. So there's a little map just to remind you where we are, about a third of the way through now, so not long to go. And this is these peculiar totem poles, these bits of public art that you may see from time to time as you go around Surrey. These are to mark and to commemorate really the Surrey Hills area of outstanding natural beauty. That is being looked at the moment, consultation exercise, to see if it can be extended, and I hope it will. When I was in post many years ago, we tried to persuade what was called the Countryside Commission in those days to extend it to give additional protection to open greenbelt land, but they didn't want to know. It was all too much for them, I think, but hopefully that might happen now. But look out for the totem poles, the Surrey Hills area of outstanding natural beauty. And we're lucky to have it. In terms of landscape designations, it's only one down from a national park, so very important. So we come to Tyler's Green, which is the hamlet really at the north end of Godstone. It's now dominated by Junction 6 on the M25, but it's an important crossroads of north-south and east-west routes, and that's why London Country had its bus garage there at Godstone, long since gone, of course. But in terms of transport, still vitally important with the motorway junction, and hidden behind the trees is a huge warehouse, which not many people know about really, but it is the highways centre for managing the motorways. As you're driving along and you hear a traffic announcement come on your car, Sylvie Blackmore talking from the BBC desk, she's in that warehouse with all the other traffic news people, and every camera on the M25, on the M2, on the M26, on the M20, on the M3, on the M27, all those cameras feed into that traffic centre, and if there's an incident on the motorway, that's where the Land Rovers are sent out from to go and sort it out. So very important location. For security reasons, it's kept pretty quiet about, but they do open it up to groups, and it's a fascinating place to see. So here we are in Godstone proper. This bit up here is called Hilly Fields, so called because there are some burial mounds there, some Bronze Age burial mounds, and there are people who go in the Hare and Hounds here. If they walk up that footpath to get back home as a shortcut at night after having a few pints, past the burial grounds, it's not a nice place to be really. But you see the traditional village green here with the White Hart, the old coaching in there, very important as a trading place. And in days gone by, as well as extracting minerals from the area, the main activity was rope making. And I'm told that if during times of drought, if you're flying over the area, you would see the route taken by people who were walking the rope, the sisal and all the other things, winding it together to make rope to sell to the Navy particularly. And I thought I could see where they used to walk until somebody pointed out, don't be daft, that's the goal line for the football pitches. Yes, you've got the bowling green and tennis courts, and it really is a quintessential English village green. And there's the pond there, and there's a nice view of the pond, sometimes in better condition than others, but generally worth a visit. The next place is called Walkingstead, but this is where the parish church is and where the court or the Lord of the Manor's house is for Godstone. This time it's a good half a mile away from the main part of the village. The church is quite distinguished as well, and among the gravestones there are a chap called, his nickname was Walker Miles, and he was the founder of the Ramblers Association. So he's buried in the churchyard at Walkingstead. That name is said to come from walking the fleeces through troughs of fuller's earth. So Walkingstead, all to do again with that very important activity of producing wool. This is Brook's Nest House, important house. What can I tell you about this? It's lived in by various famous people. Sir George Gilbert Scott, for instance, famous architect who was responsible for St Pancras Station Midland Hotel. And he also designed some almshouses which appear in that Walkingstead village. And there's a little chapel in the middle with its little spire up there. And it's a memorial chapel to a young girl who went to a ball in Godstone and died as a result of catching a chill on her way home. And she was called Fanny Hunt, and her parents donated the money to build these almshouses for distressed people from Godstone. And this chapel this chapel is open every day to the public, and it's worth a look. And George Gilbert Scott, while he was in the area, also refurbished Tandridge Village Church. Tandridge is the name, the Old Saxon name, the Old Saxon hundred name of the whole district, but there is a small village, it's a hamlet really, called Tandridge, which is right in the middle of the district, and it's got its own parish church with a very old yew tree. It vies with Crowhurst, which is also in Tandridge, as having one of the oldest yew trees in the country. This is a monument, I think it's called the Knoll, is it? Hundreds Knoll? I can't remember the list, you've got it in front of you. Yes, it marks a place where the Old Saxon Hundred, the chieftains and the lords of the manor would meet once a year to set the tithing tax, the equivalent really of the council tax today. So I suppose you could say that this was the original council offices for Tandridge district. A lot cheaper than the current ones, I can tell you. It was just a barn, just a building there. But you can see that monument, especially if you're on the top of a 410 bus going towards Oxted. This is in the village at Tandridge. This is Tandridge Court, where the Lord of the Manor would live. It's now apartments. And its main claim to fame is that it had a service quarter, which is a circular building accessed by this unusual looking archway, and in the apartments there is where the chauffeur lives, so it's called the chauffeur's flat, and that has a very famous garden which is normally open to the public under the National Garden Scheme. It's a cross between Disneyland and Wisley, if you get my meaning, but it's got some fantastic views out and a very special place to be in as well. So that's Tandridge Village. And we move on to a lot further along the A25, further along the Sandstone Ridge, and we come to Barrow Green. People used to think that this mound was a burial ground, one of these barrows, but no evidence has ever been found of any bodies there. But it's still, the name's still stuck. And just behind there is the house owned by Mohammed Al-Fayed, where Dodi Al-Fayed is buried. I think he's still there after that tragedy in Paris. This is Old Oxted, next on your list, or really, strictly speaking, we should call that Oxted, because the bigger town, the modern town, is of course New Oxted. But there were 2 breweries and half a dozen pubs in this small village. And I love this painting. I love the way this person tending the allotment there is keeping a weather eye on these children playing cricket, and they're going to squash the cabbages when they go and retrieve the ball there. But the road at Old Oxted is still pretty much like that, very steep and narrow, and there's a very distinct village. And this is what it looks like today, as in everywhere, dominated by parking and traffic, I'm afraid. Again, a very distinct sense of place. Now, in the 1930s, Surrey County Council, in its wisdom, decided that this road needed widening, because you couldn't get 2 buses crossing at 50 miles an hour down a narrow street like that, which seemed to be their rule of thumb. So they did a compulsory purchase and designed a road widening scheme that resulted in all the north side of the High Street in Old Oxted being demolished to make room for a road. And the contracts were let, and the work was about to start in September 1939, and you all know what happened then. So the outbreak of war put a stop to it, and the locals still commemorate the fact that Adolf Hitler saved Old Oxted. Here again, an ancient map, if you can see it. This is Old Oxted here. That's the road that we've been looking at. And going off in the northerly direction is Church Lane, and it leads eventually to Oxted Church. Now look at the distance between the village and the church. And this is the court here, you see where it says court, where the lord of the manor would live, and this is Court Farm all around here. So again, you see the separation of the church and the lord of the manor's accommodation from the village itself. Don't think it happens in many other places, actually. This is Oxted Mill. Not many people know about this. Lots of waterways where water soaks into the chalk of the North Downs, and where it meets the clay and the sandstone, you get springs popping up, and there's so many of them that if they're all channeled together, there's enough to drive a water mill. And this is one. It was still milling until the 1960s, actually. There's now some local offices that use the building. Pleased to see it in use and kept in such good condition. So we come on to what, strictly speaking, is New Oxted, the creature of the railway times, of course. He's the Station Road West. And I was once, years and years ago, walking up and down Station Road West here about my business, and there was an American tourist who happened to be visiting the town that day, and they said, "Excuse me," they said, "is that a genuine Tudor cinema?" None of it is Tudor, of course. It's all a recreation of it. The top of the road there is Oxted Station. Now, back in 1913, the suffragettes were very active, and they had a bombing campaign. It's not much talked about these days, and their intention was not to kill people, but to draw attention to their cause. And they had a particular target of railway stations, just to cause a bit of mayhem and disruption without actually hurting anybody. And indeed, Oxted Station was chosen as a target for the bomb, and it went off in the gents' toilet. I can tell you, go in there on a Sunday morning sometimes, and it smells as if a bomb's gone off. Anyway, nobody owned up to this, but it transpired later that It was Harold Lasky who did it, who was a professor at the London School of Economics and who happened to be chairman of the Labour Party at the time. So no wonder they kept quiet about it, but it was him what done it. Come on, move on. So, I think you've got a gas holder in Hawley, have you not? Have you still got it? Still there? Yes, God. Well, Oxted was dominated by this gas holder for many years. It wasn't one that went up and down. It had a big canvas tent inside it that went up and down as the gas was supplied in and was used up. But it's gone now, and this is during the demolition. Big hole cut in the side there, and I said to this chap with the high-vis jacket on, I said, it's very dark in there, isn't it? He says, yeah, you can't see a thing. I said, well, if you like, I'll go up there and strike a match. didn't want to know. So there you see it, now you don't. This block of flats has just been finished there now, and looks very nice. Although I think people still miss the old gas holder. Now, who remembers the Ealing comedies? The Titfield Thunderbolt, a resident of New Oxted, was a chap called T.B. Clark. He's got a credit in very small writing at the bottom. He was a staff scriptwriter for Ealing Studios, and he devised this play, which was the basis of this famous film, and he was looking for a title for it. And what was he going to call this little locomotive that was the star of the show? Well, from where he lived in Oxted, if he looked out of one window, he could see the hamlet of Titsey, and if he looked out the other window, he could see the village of Limpsfield. So he put the two together, and he got Titfield Thunderbolt. I'm just grateful he didn't get it the other way round and call it the Limp Tit Thunderbolt. Not quite the same ring, is it? But there you are, a bit of local culture for you. And also we've got the Meridian that passes through the main shopping street, which is Station Road East in Oxted. These are, back in 2018, I think it was, the Royal Mint issued 26 10p coins, each with a different letter of the alphabet, and they chose G for the Greenwich Meridian, all typically British features. C was a cricket match that they put on the coin. B was breakfast, and it had bacon and eggs on it, for instance, and that was the sort of thing that they had. But if you just look carefully, you can see Oxted there, under the Greenwich Meridian. And there are plaques on the shops to show exactly where it is. Now, there was a development on the old railway station yard in which I was involved, and there's an underpass under the railway which splits the town in two. So it was important that this underpass was improved and enhanced. And the developers of the supermarket on the railway station yard, after I twisted their arms a bit, coughed up £8,000 to have some improvements and extensions done to the subway under the railway. And I thought that this sort of mosaic work would be good, and indeed it's proved to be successful because it has never been graffitied. There's, the paint just doesn't look anything if you do it. But I said to the artist who designed the mosaic, can I see what you're going to do before you start work on it? And he showed me this drawing, and it showed two booted and suited gentlemen strutting off with their times under their arms to get the 750 from Oxted to London Bridge. And about 10 yards behind them was a woman pushing a baby in the buggy. And I said that I didn't really think, this is going back years. I was ahead of my time in political correctness. I said, I don't think that is really the best image for what's going to be very shortly the 21st century. So against his will, he amended it to show a man and a woman going off to work. If you look on the other side of the subway, the design incorporates a rather grumpy-looking little boy, which I think is the mosaic artist in High Dudgeon at being told by a mere planning officer what he shouldn't and shouldn't have in his designs. So we come on, I think next place is Tyler's Green, not to be confused with Tyler's Green, which we've already been to, what seems like about 3 hours ago. Tyler's Green is bounded by this very old house, which is called Ratcatcher's Cottage, and that's what it looks like today, and you can see a pussycat chasing a rat on the weather vane there. So this is Tyler's Green. It's a bit of what they call manorial waste, and it's got a restored finger post sign. I know that some people are very keen on signs in this society. That's the best I can offer you this time. Many of the villages that we've gone through have got signs. Perhaps I ought to put pictures of them in it as well. But this is an old sign that would have been in evidence 100 years ago or so on Tyler's Green. And there's another view of it. It's got a horse trough. There's the finger post sign. It's got this sort of structure there. But altogether, it's got so much junk, street furniture, cabinets, road signs, you name it. I think they ought to call it Untidy's Green these days. But that's just as we come into the village of Limpsfield, which is another celebrated and very historic place. Down in the high street of Limpsfield village, there was a house there which is called Braziers, and Braziers were the builders and undertakers back in the historical day. And a young man from the Brazier family decided he'd had enough. He'd go and make his fortune by buying a farm in Wiltshire, which he did. They then had a son who got ordained into the Church of England, and he became chaplain at All Saints Hospital in Eastbourne, at which point they had a daughter who was called Theresa Brazier, and she went on to be the second female Prime Minister of England, Theresa May. So we've got another prime ministerial connection there. We've just had the 100th anniversary, have we not, of the BBC, and one of the very first outside broadcasts were talking about the nightingale that we saw at the beginning. Do you know this story about there was a famous distinguished cellist called Beatrice Harrison who lived in Limpsfield, and she wrote to her friend who was a Director General of the first Director General of what was then the British Broadcasting Company, and said, about time you did an outside broadcast, if I go out onto my terrace and play the cello, a nightingale always sings with me in the early evening, and you ought to get your technicians down here. And indeed they did an outside broadcast, and the nation could hear the nightingale. The only problem was the blessed nightingale didn't turn up that night, typical, isn't it? And so they got a bird impersonator to whistle away. This only came out on the 100th anniversary. Until then, everybody thought it was a genuine story. Of course, every other night, the bird came out, and they did it on the anniversary, and every night that bird, or a bird, came out and tweeted away as she was strumming away on the old cello there. And this went on for years and years, and it only later on, about 1940 I think, when the War Department said to the BBC, you know, if there's chaps over in Germany listening to the BBC, and this woman is out there on her terrace playing her cello with a nightingale, if she's doing that, the Germans will know that it's not raining and it's not blowing a gale over the south of England, and they will send the bombers in. So they stopped it. So it's another thing that happened because of the war. The churchyard at Limpsfield is very celebrated as well with Musicians' Corner. A lot of English famous musicians are there, so Thomas Beecham, Frederick Delius is buried there, and in fact it was Beatrice Harrison and some of her musician friends that brought his body back from France where he died. So it's a celebrated place for English music. Also, another celebrity that lived in Limpsfield was Colin Cowdrey, captain of Kent County Cricket Club, and very distinguished player and captain of England, one of the few sportsmen to have had a memorial service at Westminster Abbey. But Kent County Cricket Club had a rule that their captain has to live in Kent, has to live in the county. Mrs. Cowdrey wasn't having any of that. She said, I like it living in Limpsfield, and that's where we're going to stay. So Colin had to go cap in hand to the board of the Kent County Cricket Club and said, we're not moving, but how about if I call my house Kentish Border? Because it was only a few hundred yards from the border with Kent anyway. And so they let him off. It would have been better, actually, if they called it Kentish Boundary, I always think, because a cricketer is always striving for boundaries, aren't they? Limpsfield Chart is next. This is a distinct and freestanding hamlet. Very strong community spirit there. Again, a few celebrities about the place. The author Joseph Conrad lived there, and he was part of what's called the Limpsfield and Limpsfield Chart literary set. Harold Lasky, we talked about, he was a member not only of the Labour Party but also of the Fabian Society, and there were families that started the Fabian Society in Limpsfield, and it seems ironic that in big houses in a traditional sort of stockbroker belt in the village, distinguished village of Limpsfield, should have such strong socialist leanings there, but that's the way things developed. And we then come to Moor House, which is just a few scattered buildings really, very close to the Kent boundary, but some unusual looking oast house structures there, and some other quite rustic buildings about the place, quite remote really. It's very close to Clackett Lane, the service area on the M25. Everybody says Clackett's. I correct them, say it's Clackett. Mercifully, there's only one of them. And it is probably the worst spot for crime in the whole of the county of Surrey in terms of prostitution, drug dealing, illegal immigration, and all other nefarious activities. This is right on the boundary with Kent as we pass through from Surrey. It's called the Devil of Kent, and it is a wooded hill, as you see there, and that in amongst the woods, so at the top of that hill is a very stagnant and ancient pond. And during the summer evenings, calm summer evenings, the methane gas rises up from the bottom of the pond. Sorry about this. And causes a shimmering of coloured vapour or gases on the surface of the pond. In the old days, before people realised that it was methane coming up, they thought it was some sort of spooky thing, and that's the origin of the term will-o'-the-wisp. So if you hear the term will-o'-the-wisp, it's usually associated with some sort of haunting or mystery. And it is a bit of a spooky place even to this day, despite its close proximity to Clackett Lane service area. So we come then to the first settlement in Kent, travelling in this direction, and there you see a splendid statue of General Wolfe. I'm going to move around a bit, hopefully this crackling will stop. General Wolfe, of course, was a very celebrated soldier in the campaigns to quell the French in Canada, and the Battle of Heights of Abraham, he lost his life, but as a favourite son of Westerham, he's commemorated with this famous statue. He's usually got a gin bottle on the end of his sword, but it seems to have passed on that one. And there's Mrs. Evans paying her respects to Westerham's other favourite son, with Chartwell being just a few yards down the road, that famous statue of Winston Churchill. Now, John Lennon had to travel along the A25 one day in his chauffeur-driven car to Sevenoaks, where he was making one of the first pop videos, if you like, for the Strawberry Fields song. and he said to his driver, "Can you stop? Can you stop in this nice village?" Thanks very much. Thank you. I'll just shout, shall I? And well, they stopped outside this antique shop, and John Lennon had an eye for objets d'art, and he came across this old circus poster. He thought that looked rather nice on the wall, and I like the words of it, and I think I'm going to write a song about it. And you see there that most of these words are for the benefit of Mr. Kite. There will be a show tonight on trampoline. The Hendersons will all be there. Later, Pablo Fanke's fair. What a scene. And Henry the horse dances the waltz. I don't think he could fit in. There's the name of a horse on there somewhere which he couldn't use, but that is, you know, one of the best-selling LPs of all time. Was inspired, the opening track on it was inspired by this circus poster that he bought in Westerham. And there he is with it on his wall. So there's Mrs. Evans sloping out of the little grasshopper on the Green pub, just behind that statue of Winston Churchill. And the story goes that when he used to come home from the House of Commons late at night in his chauffeur-driven car, he would stop off in the village. He'd go perhaps to the King's Arms opposite this, or his favourite was the Grasshopper, to have a quick brandy before he got home. Clemmy didn't like him drinking. You drink too much, Winston, you know, you're not in the best of health. You really ought to ease up on it. So before he went home to Chartwell and have his ear bent by his wife, he would call in here and have a swift nightcap, if you like. And the story goes that he was in there one night and he paid a visit to the gents, and he came out and a young man in the bar said to him, "Excuse me, sir, your flies are undone." And Churchill is reported to have said, "Don't worry, young man, a dead bird never falls out of the nest." Anybody know that trouble? And there he is, of course. I love my coins, and he was the first commoner really to appear on the Churchill crown from 1965. So here we are in the churchyard at Westerham. There are the delicate ankles of Mrs. Evans, showing the scale and finery of the cobblestones that adorn this part of the world. That they are made of ironstone, which is another mineral that was highly prized and which helped kick off the Wealden iron industry during late medieval times. A very important thing, but it just shows how important horizontal surfaces are. You know, we all like our nice buildings and walls of buildings. Perhaps we always give insufficient attention to what's on the ground that we walk on, and this is a good example of some super ones. Sorry, jumping ahead there. Actually, I just remembered when we were looking at Rook's Nest House, the one where the architect lived, Gilbert Scott. Going back to the little quiz that I posed at the beginning about the wisteria plant. Now, they claim to have the first wisteria plant on the wall of that house in Godstone. But there was a rival claim to having the first wisteria plant on Fuller's Brewery in West London, where they make London Pride, of course, if you like your beer. Now, in Rook's Nest farmhouse in Godstone was a man called Turner, and he had a brother who was a plant collector. He went to China and he brought back the first wisteria plant. They're not native to this country, and these things have got to start somewhere, and the wisteria plant was brought back to Rook's Nest Farm to Mr. Turner by his brother, another Mr. Turner, and it thrived there for many years. So how do we resolve this dispute? Fuller's Brewery reckon they had the first one. Mr. Turner at Rook's Nest House reckons he had the first one. Well, that Mr. Turner, of course, if you know your brewers, the full name of the Fuller's Brewery at the Griffin Brewery in Chiswick is Fuller, Smith and Turner, and he is the same man who obviously gave a cutting to the manager at the brewery and that plant is still going to this day, sadly not at Rook's Nest. I should have mentioned that as we went along, but you know how it is when you get carried away. I even forgot about beer for a moment. So we got a nice churchyard then at Westerham, back in on the Kent side. Fantastic views over the landscape from there. We've got this National Trust house here, which is where General Wolfe was born and brought up, which is open, and there's a famous painting in there of the Battle of the Heights of Abraham, where their favourite son was killed. And this is Square's Court. This was a very fine house, used to be open to the public, but nowadays they get more money from hosting corporate events, and they don't want the great unwashed traipsing through the house anymore, which is a bit sad. But it was very nice. It's used in a lot of films as well. Now, when I do this talk, it's very often in a church hall or even in a place of worship, so I always finish with the biblical reference about the pearl of great value. And that's just a nice way to end this talk about the string of pearls. I hope you've enjoyed our journey tonight. Thank you for listening.